Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parabrahm, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Dhyanamoolam Guru Murti Pujamulam Guru Padam Mantramulam Guru Vakya Mokshamulam Guru Kripa. Shivam friends, today we will take the reading of chapter 68 Upasna Khand, Yoga Vasishtha Maharamayan. And in this chapter 68, the pain of attachment, the liberation of non-attachment is discussed. Ramji said, "Tell me, sage, what are the connections that become the bondages of men? How are they to be avoided? What is that connection that leads to their emancipation in this life?" Vasishtha answered, "The division of unity into the duality of the body and soul, and the rejection of the later part, the soul, produce the mistaken belief in only the body. This is called the association of bondage." Again, taking the infinite soul to be a finite being confined to the body leads to the bondage of the soul. But the conviction that this whole cosmos is identical soul and therefore we have nothing to choose or reject in it other than the soul is termed the unrelated condition of the mind settled only in the Supreme Soul. This state is known as living liberation. The unattached and self liberated man thinks, "Neither do I exist, nor do these others exist. Let any good or evil, pleasure or pain befall me. I am not to be changed in any condition of life." He is undistracted and self-devoted who doesn't foster his desires or hanker after things or continues thinking he is doing actions. The self-devoted man whose mind is not subject to feelings of joy or sorrow and who is indifferent to worldly matters is truly said to be liberated in his lifetime. He whose mind is not concerned about the results of his actions but takes them lightly as they come to pass upon him. Such a man is said to be lacking vigor and is lukewarm in his mind. All our efforts, impelled by various motives, are avoided by our indifference to those pursuits. This lack of concern about worldly matters produces our greatest good. We load innumerable distresses upon ourselves because of our concerns with many things. All worldly cares serve only to multiply the growing ills of life, like branching thorny bushes in caves. The effect of worldly attachment drives a silly man to labor under their heavy burdens, just as the dastardly donkeys are dragged by their nose strings to trudge and drudge under their lords in long and lonesome journeys. One's attachment to home and country makes him stand in one place like an immovable tree and endure all the rigors of heat, cold, winds, and rains without sinking. See, the reptiles confined in the caves of earth with their weak bodies and tortuous movements, they are examples of early attachment. passing their time in pain and agony and in continuous helplessness. See the poor birds resting on the tops of trees, winning their while with cries of their empty stomachs and constant fear of predators as examples of worldly attachment. Observe the frightened fawn grazing on tender blades of grass and dreading the darts of hunters to serve as another example of earthly inclination. The transformation of man into worms and insects in their repeated reincarnations, and the congregation of all these animals of all kinds in all places are only examples of their earthly fondness. The multitudes of animals, beings that you see rising and falling like the waves of the sea, are all the effects of their worldly attachment. The self moving man becomes immovable and turns into the state of fixed trees and plants, growing and dying by turns because of his worldly propensities. Grass, shrubs, and vines that grow on earth from its moisture are all products of the cause of their addiction to the world. These endless processions of beings carried away in this running stream of the world are buffeted by their ever increasing difficulties, are all the play of their earthly inclinations. Worldly affections are of two kinds, the praiseworthy and the fruitless. Those of the wise and learned man belong to the former praiseworthy kind, but the tendencies of the ignorant are of the later unfruitful kind. Any tendency towards this world which springs from base bodily or mental affection and which doesn't proceed from or bears any relation to spiritual motives and purposes is said to be quite fruitless of any good result. But that tendency which has its origin in spiritual knowledge and in true and right discrimination and bears no relation to anything that is of this world but leads to one's future and spiritual welfare is the truly praiseworthy one. The god Vishnu, holding the symbols of the conch shell, his discus and the club, had various inclination of this better kind, whereby he became the support of the three worlds. By means of this good tendency, the glorious sun makes its daily course in the unsupported path of heaven for evermore. The god Brahma, who now shines in his fiery form, had to foster his project of creation for an entire Kalp age. Owing to this praiseworthy purpose, he became the creator of the world. It was because of this kind of praiseworthy purpose that the god Shiva acquired his half man, half woman body, graced by the female form of Uma, linked with his as its other half. The spiritual masters and other heavenly and aerial beings, and the rulers of the skies who move in their spiritual spheres of intelligence have all attained their high positions by means of their praiseworthy tendency. They bear their bodies of heavenly growth and have set themselves beyond the reach of disease, decay, and death by means of their praiseworthy inclinations. Fruitless desires expects to derive pleasure from unworthy objects and causes the mind to pounce like a vulture on a bit of flesh. Force of habit makes the winds to blow in their habitual course and causes the five elements to continue in their usual states in support of the order of nature. This force of habit constitutes the constitution of the system of nature, composed of the heavens, earth, and infernal regions, and peopled by gods, men, demons, and other beings. all of whom are like gnats fluttering about the fruit of the mundane fig tree. Numberless orders of beings are born, grow and fall and die away like the ceaseless waves of the sea. The results of worldly inclinations rise and fall by turns until they disappear all at once. They are as bitter to taste as the drops of waterfalls. Mere worldliness makes these crowds of men devour one another like sharks and fishes. They are so infatuated by their ignorance that they have been flying about like stray tree leaves in the wind. Worldly learnings make men wander about like revolving stars in their courses in the sky, or flutter about like flights of gnats on fig trees, or lie low like the swirling waters of whirling currents underneath the ground. The hands of fate and death toss man around like a child's play ball and wears man out like these toys by their constant rise and fall and rolling upon the ground. Yet these worrying wanderings don't abate the force of their habitual motions, like the repeated waxing and waning of the ever changing moon, make no change in the blackish spot marked upon her disk. The mind is hardened by seeing the miseries of repeated revolutions of ages, resembling the rotations of fragments of wood in whirlpools. Yet the gods will not consent to heal the strong boiling of the mind by any operation in their power. O Ram, this wonderful frame of the universe is only the product of the desire of the divine mind. The pleasure of association presents this sight of the triple world in the empty sphere of the mind. No, this wonderful world is only a creation of the mind and nothing in reality. The greed of worldly men eats up their bodies like fire feeding upon dry fuel. Yet the bodies of worldly minded men are as countless as the sands of the sea, and these again are as unnumbered as the atoms of earth which nobody can count. It may be possible to count the white foams of the Ganges river and the pearly froths of sea waves. It is likewise possible to measure the height of the Mount Meru from its foot to the top and its peaks. But it is impossible to number the desires in the minds of worldly minded men. These rows of inner apartments, built for the home of the worldly minded, are like the lines of Kala Sutra and the spires of hellfire. No, these worldly men are like dry fuel heaped up to light the piles of hellfire. No, all things in this world are full of pain and misery, stored up not for enjoyment, but to torment the worldly minded. The minds of all worldly men are the receptacles of all sorrow and misery, just as the great sea is the recess of the outpourings of all rivers. The mind attached to the world and the body bent down under its laborious loads are both fields for the exercise of ignorance, which elevates and depresses them by turns. Want of attachment to worldly enjoyments produces ease and prosperity. It expands the capacity of the mind like rain increases the extent of rivers. Inner attachment of the mind to worldly objects is the burning flame of the outer body, but the absence of this internal attachment is the healing balm for the entire being. Inner attachment burns the outer body like a hidden poisonous plant infects the vines that grow on it for support. The mind, unattached to everything in all places, is like the lofty sky, aloof from all things. By having no desire in the mind, it is always clear and bright and enjoy its joy forever. As the light of knowledge rises before the sight of the mind, darkness of the ignorance which veiled all objects wastes away of itself and is put to flight. The man who is devoid of all sorts of worldly attachments and lives in communion with his own mind is truly liberated in his life. This was chapter 68. And in the chapter 69, we will discuss living without attachment. Vasishtha continued, though remaining in all company and doing all the duties of life, and although employed in all the acts, yet a wise man watches the movements of his mind. The mind is not to be engaged in cares of this world or employed in thoughts relating to this life. It is not to be fixed in the sky above or on the earth below, or let to wander about over objects on all sides. It must not roam over the extensive field of outward enjoyments or dwell on the objects and actions of the senses. It must not look internally or be fixed upon breathing, the palate, or the crown of the head. It must not be attached to the eyebrows, the tip of the nose, the mouth, or the pupil of the eye, nor should it look into the light or darkness or into the cavity of the heart. It must not think of its waking or dreaming states, nor those of its sound sleep or internal clearness of sight, nor should it take any color as white, red, black, or yellow for the object of its thought or sight. It must not be fixed on any moving or unmoving substance or set in the beginning, middle, or end of any object. It must not take a distant or adjacent object either before or inside itself. It must not reflect on any tangible or audible object or on the states of joy and unconsciousness. It must not think of fleetness or the measurement of time by the measure of number of its thoughts. Let it rest in consciousness only with a slight intelligence of itself, tasting no joy except that of its self delight. Being in this state of mind and devoid of at all attachment to anything, the living man becomes like a dead body. He is at liberty to pursue his worldly callings or no. The living being who is attached to the thought of himself is said to be doing and acting, though he refrains from doing anything. He is as free from the consequence of acts as the sky is free from the shade of the clouds that hang below it. Or he may forsake his intelligential part and become one with the mass of consciousness itself. The living soul thus becomes calm and quiet in itself and shines with a light as searing as a bright gem in a mine. The soul, being thus extinct in itself, is said to rise in the sphere of consciousness. The animal soul, continuing in its acts with an unwilling mind, is not subject to results of the actions in its embodied state. This is chapter 69, very short one. And in the chapter 70, the perfect bliss of living liberation is discussed. Vasishtha continued, men whose souls are expanded and content with the delight of their habitual unattachment to worldliness have set themselves above the reach of internal sorrow and fear, even though they may be engaged in worldly affairs. Though overtaken by inner sorrow, yet their countenances are unchanged, owing to their uninterrupted meditation. The fullness of their hearts with holy delights is manifest in the moon-like brightness of their faces. He whose mind relies on the intellect to be free of the feverishness of the world and who remains apart from the objects of reasoning throws a luster over those around him, just as the clearing kata fruit purifies water. The wise man, though he may be moving about in busy affairs, is always quiet, having withdrawn his soul from them. He may be attacked by outward sorrow, yet his inner soul shines like an image of the sun. Man of great souls, awakened and enlightened by knowledge, and raised high above the rest of mankind, waver on the outside like a peacock's feather, but inwardly they are as firm as a mountain of rock. The mind controlled by the soul is no longer susceptible to the feelings of pleasure and pain, and any more than a piece of painted glass receives the shadow of any other color. The man of elevated mind, who has known the nature of superior and inferior souls, is not affected by the sight of phenomena any more than a lotus leaf is affected by the color of its surrounding waters. It's impossible to evade the impressions of the outer world until and unless the mind is strengthened in itself. The mind becomes strong by its knowledge of the Supreme Spirit, by removing the foulness of its fancied objects, and by meditation and enjoyment of the light of the soul, even when the mind is not in its meditative mood. The mind loses its attachments through spiritual communion and internal bliss. Our worldly associations wear out of themselves only by knowledge of the soul. There is no other way. The waking soul may consider itself to be in sound sleep by its unconsciousness of the outer world. Likewise, it may consider itself to be ever awake and never asleep by its sight of the unfading light of the soul. By preservation of its equanimity and equality in all circumstances, and its lack of duality and differentiation of the objects of its love and hatred. Being ripe in its practice of yoga meditation, the soul sees the pure light of the sun in itself until at last it finds its own and the supreme soul shining like the sun and moon in conjunction. When the mind loses its mental powers and remains vacant as if distracted or demented, and its faculty to imagine is at an utter stop, it is said to be in its deep sleep in wakefulness. The man, having attained this state, may live to discharge the duties of his life, but he will be dragged one side or the other by the rope of his happiness or sorrow. Whatever actions are done in this world by a man in his state of deep sleep in wakefulness, they don't inflict him with their good or evil results, any more than a dancing puppet has any sense of pleasure or pain in its actions. The mind possesses the power of giving us the perceptions of our pain and pleasures, and the sense of our want and bitter sorrow. But when the mind is assimilated with the soul, how can it have the power of knowing us anymore? The man in the hypnotic state of his mind does his works as insensibly as he did them in his sleep, because it does them with no effort on his part and not because of his formal habitual practice. The living soul that is unconscious of its actions is set to rest in its state of living liberation. Rely upon this state of deep sleep while awake, and either perform or refrain from your actions as you may like. Our actions are only what arise of our nature. They pass for the results of the deeds of our past lives, and they are enacted by ordinances of eternal laws. A wise man is not pleased with the acts of charity or penury. He is delighted with his knowledge of the soul and lives content with whatever may fall to his lot. All that you do with your mind by refraining as still as in your sleep, is reckoned as no doing of yours. Though doing nothing with your body, you are the doer if you do it with your mind. Therefore, do your acts with your body or mind as you may like. As a baby lying in the cradle move its limb to no other purpose than its mere pleasure. O so Ram, do your duties for pleasure's sake and for not for reward. Whoever has his mind fixed in his consciousness and not in any object of reasoning, and remains dormant in his waking state, is said to be master of his soul. All he does is reckoned as no deed of his doing. The wise man who obtains the state of deep sleep while awake and has freed his mind from desires gets a calm coolness within himself, which is equal to the cooling moisture of the winged moon. The man of great valor remains coolly dormant in himself and is as full as the orb of the moon in the fullness of her digits. He has the evenness of his mind, and at all times and seasons, like the steadiness of a hill. The man with a calm soul is pliable in his outer conduct, though he is inflexible in his mind. He resembles a mountain whose trees wave with the breeze without being shaken. Samadhi purifies the body of all its impurity. It is the same whether a person in Samadhi perishes sooner or later or lasts forever as a rock. This state of Samadhi, which is acquired by constant practice of yoga, becomes mature and perfect with time until it becomes what is called the fourth stage, Turiya Avastha, by the spiritual masters and those learned in divine knowledge. He becomes the most exalted yogi whose mind is cleared of all its impurities and whose inner soul is full of joy. Its mental powers are quiet and at rest. In this state, the yogi is in full bliss and quite giddy with inner delight. He looks upon the whole of creation as an exhibition of play and a cosmic dance. Once a man has attained his fourth stage, when is he free from sorrow and fear and has passed beyond the airs and troubles of this world, he has no fear of falling from this state. The man of calm understanding who has attained this holy state laughs to scorn and spurn at the whirling orb of the earth, just as one sitting on a high hill looks down upon objects lying below it. After one has obtained his everlasting position in this firmly fixed fourth state of blissfulness, he becomes joyless for the lack of a higher state of joy to desire. The yogi, having passed his fourth stage, reaches a state of indescribable joy which has no part or degree in it and is absolute liberation in itself. The man of great soul is released from the snare of the reincarnation of his soul and of his repeated birth and death, and is freed from the darkness of his pride and egoism. He is transformed into an essence of supreme ecstasy, pure flavor, and becomes like a mass of sea salt in waters of deep. With this, chapter 70 also comes to an end, and I think we should rest our today's session here itself. Again, we will meet with the reading of chapter 71 onwards. Until then, Shivoham, friends.